everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. My name is Lori Margolin, and I'm a graduate of the MSW program and a member of the Dean's Alumni Advisory Board at Penn's School of Social Policy and Practice, also known as SP2. On behalf of the Dean's Alumni Advisory Board, I'd like to welcome you all to today's event. We're thrilled to partner with SP2 to present this third installment of the 2023-2024 virtual SP2 Speaker Series. This one, conversations about race, equity, and justice with experts on social policy and social work. Now it is my pleasure to welcome SP2 Dean Sally Backman.
Thank you so much, Lori. I really appreciate that. And welcome, everyone. We're so excited to be partnering with our Dean's Alumni Advisory Board for this very important discussion. Today's program, SCOTUS, How It is Reshaping American Politics, will be hosted by our friend and colleague, Ben Jealous, who serves as a professor of the practice at SP2 and also at the Annenberg School for Communication. Ben is a former national president and CEO of the NAACP, and he's now the executive director of the Sierra Club. Ben has an unwavering commitment to social change and racial justice. And all of this is in perfect alignment with SP2's mission. When he was selected to be the head of the NAACP at age 35, he became the organization's youngest ever national leader. His family's strong community activism dates back generations, and I'm proud to say that our connection with him traces back many decades to when his late beloved grandmother was a student right here at SP2. Today's conversation is an example of SP2's dedication to addressing complex social problems through education, research, and civic engagement. And now it's my great pleasure to turn this over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Sally. I continue to be excited to host this series, and today's program is a real special pleasure. My old friend, Michael Waldman, one of the great thinkers on the U.S. Constitution, one of the great activist scholars in our nation, is joining us for lunch today. We're going to have a whole lot of fun. And I suspect folks will have questions. Please use the Q&A tab to submit them. We will get to as many as possible. And now to say a bit more about Mr. Waldman. He joins us from the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University's School of Law, where he is president and CEO of the Brennan Center. Michael is a constitutional lawyer and writer who is an expert on the presidency and American democracy. He has led the center since 2005. He was a member of the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the U.S. in 2021. Michael was director of speech writing for President Bill Clinton from 1995 to 1999, serving as assistant to the president. He was responsible for writing or editing nearly 2,000 speeches, including 4 State of the Union and 2 inaugural addresses. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining us.
It's great to be with you. Thank you, Dean Bachman. And it's just a treat and an honor for me to be with Ben Jealous, who, as all of you know, is one of the extraordinary leaders in our country for democracy, for racial justice, for the environment and climate, and the ways they all intertwine. So it's great to be with you.
Thank you. I've been really looking forward to this. And let's just kind of dive into it. You've got a new book out, Super Majority. In this book, you argue that the Supreme Court's 2022-2023 term was one of the most consequential in decades. Can you speak about some of the decisions that came out of that term, how they're reshaping politics? And while you're at it, why not tell us a bit about what you're anticipating this term?
Yeah, absolutely. The book is called The Supermajority, and that's because the Supreme Court, as central and important as it is in our governmental system, is now controlled by 6 of 9 very conservative justices, moving largely in lockstep, and they're making extraordinarily significant changes in how they read the Constitution, how the law affects all of our lives. And that is happening very fast and with a great deal of controversy, but not much accountability. The book looks in particular at the first full term of the supermajority, which ended in June of 2022. And in 3 days in that month, they changed the country. There was the Dobbs decision, which I'm sure most people are familiar with, where they overturned Roe v. Wade, which had protected women's fundamental right to reproductive choice in the federal constitution for half a century. But more than that, they did it in a way that put at risk all the other privacy rights that had been interpreted to be in the Constitution. The day before that was the Bruin case, which was less known probably than Dobbs, but which was by far the most radical, I would argue, Second Amendment case in the country's history. In the Bruin case, they said basically that you cannot consider current public safety needs in deciding whether something is constitutional under the Second Amendment, a gun restriction. Only history and tradition. In other words, what was the gun law back in the late 1700s? And the third day is a case that will have huge ramifications. It's called West Virginia versus EPA. It was about climate change, but it was even more broadly the beginning of this Supreme Court supermajority's effort to use the court, to use the Constitution to really significantly restrict what government can do to protect the environment, to protect worker safety, to regulate the economy, all in 3 days, decades of social change. And so the book asks the question of how did this happen? How can this happen? Has there been a moment like this before in our country's history? I say there have been. And what can those of us who think this is not such a good thing do about it?
By the way, just a note to the folks who have joined us who are not used to seeing me recline in a chair. I have torn my quadriceps tendon. I'm convalescing at home, so excuse my kind of casual posture and demeanor. Michael, let's talk about how we got here. I mean, obviously there's 6 votes, but there's a lot more that goes into getting that. And honestly, you and I both know there's a whole industry behind. And you can, shaping this court, shaping how they think. You can go back to the unholy alliance that Karl Rove and others started to create in the 1970s between corporate folks who wanted a court that would give them kind of more unbridled control over our society, and far right-wing evangelicals that were looking for a sponsor in politics and building their movement. I mean, paint as much of that picture as you think our folks need to understand.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, the Supreme Court quite plainly has been captured by a faction of a faction. It's noteworthy to just put a human face on what you're describing as the different kinds of forces that combined to create this court. The Citizens United case, which was in 2010, was argued by the General Counsel of the National Right to Life Committee. Even though the principal beneficiaries of that case was business money, and rather than their social movement. So over several decades' time, and in part in backlash, in part in response to the more liberal Supreme Court of the 1960s and 1970s, a very, very focused legal conservative movement aimed to basically have in place the court we have now, and not just the Supreme Court, but also many, many lower court judges. One of the things that people know about, of course, is the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society is like nothing we've ever had in American history. It started as a student club. We're all, as a country, we were all very conspiracy focused, not just now, but going back, people have been, to the know nothings, and they're going back throughout American history. There's been a lot of susceptibility to conspiracy theories. This is in plain sight. It is both an ideological group. It cultivates people to become judges. It pushes very hard for their nomination to the court. The head of the Federalist Society, de facto, Leonard Leo, was tapped by President Trump, to lead the process of judicial nominations. The Federalist Society gave Trump the list in the 2016 campaign. That Trump proudly said that was who he was going to base his nominations off of. They fight to get these people confirmed, and they fight to then litigate in front of the court to push these doctrines, to push these often quite radical ideas. And, you know, I used to look, and Ben, you probably did too, we would look at the Federalist Society. I don't know about you. I would say, wow, you know, they're really effective. And they don't actually seem to have that much money compared to their seeming effectiveness. And then it turns out that someone had anonymously given Leonard Leo a few years ago 1.6 billion with a B dollars to use. So it turned out they were not a scrappy, underfunded operation after all. And that's everything from tens of millions of dollars of TV ads for justices, tens of millions of dollars of ads, praising the senators who blocked President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland, creating the groups that bring these cases, and more. So it is an ideological lockstep operation, a well-funded and well-oiled machine, all of which taking significant power in the least accountable, powerful branch of the government. That's the part of this that I think we have to always remember. These are 9 people, 9 government officials who are there for lifetime appointments, and they're not elected. They have unusual and extraordinary power in our system, and are thus more susceptible to using that power without accountability.
So let's kind of go. You remember at the end of the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, occasionally he would become like Karnak, and you had that character with the crystal ball. Like, what does your crystal ball say about what we're in store for? We just had this radical term last year. They got more stuff this year. There appears like there might be an end game with Trump. Certainly that's burning up the airwaves on MSNBC and everything else. What do you think that we're in store for in the next few months? Supreme Court decisions coming down.
So this term, so last term, the second term of this supermajority, the big case was on affirmative action, ending affirmative action and race-conscious admissions in university admissions. Again, very much upending how all higher education did admissions. There were 2 cases last June that were not catastrophes. That would be the kind of happy way I would put it. And all of which suggests that John Roberts, who is very much part of this supermajority, but has his hand on the steering wheel, wants it to steer in the same direction, but has his foot on the brake sometimes. They did not finish demolishing the Voting Rights Act, which is the great civil rights law that protects against racial discrimination in voting, as was expected that they would. And they did not embrace, they actually rejected something called the independent state legislature theory, which was kind of a crackpot idea, frankly, that said that the Constitution had given state legislatures the power to set federal election rules without checks and balances from state courts or constitutions or governors. And it was a made up idea that there's no way they should have ruled that was the thing, but they rejected it. And both of these cases were good, but they were also leaving well enough alone and basically declining to further weaken voting rules. But that was last term. This term, what's particularly significant in a series of cases are continuing the line of cases where they are going to quietly, with less drama than something like the Dobbs case, but very, very significantly, use their interpretation of the Constitution to cut back on the ability of government to act to protect people. Environmental regulation, regulation of the markets, securities markets, and all other kinds of things. In that case, I mentioned the West Virginia versus EPA case. They said then, for the first time, they said there's something called the major questions doctrine, which said that even if Congress passed a law that gave, in that case, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the authority to do this climate change rule, it was too big a topic and Congress couldn't have really meant that. If something is a, quote, major question, and they never said what that means. What is a major question that's too big for the regulatory agency to act? This term, we know that they're very likely to overturn something called the Chevron deference doctrine, which, don't worry, that won't be on the test. But what that is it's many, many decades. And it's basically the idea that when there's an ambiguous law, that the experts in the regulatory agencies, the scientists and others, can interpret that without being second guessed by judges. They're also looking at everything from how agencies are funded to what kind of appointments they have. And over and over and over again, these all serve to cut back, to use the allegedly constitutional doctrine to cut back on what kind of things government can do to protect people. In the 1930s, and this is my book talks a lot about earlier fights over the court and the Constitution. One of those culminated in 1937 when the court of that time was trying to strike down the New Deal, to say that you could not use government to protect people in that era. And this is when FDR went to war with the court. He proposed court expansion, court packing, as it was called. Roosevelt lost. It actually was really damaging to him and the Democrats at the time. But the court also backed down and said, you know what? We're going to back off. We're not going to try to impose libertarian economic theories on the government. And that's how we built a modern country. That's how we built the country we have. There are some people, though, who thought of that as a great tragedy. They call it the Constitution in exile. They think it was a terrible mistake to not use the courts to stop government from regulating the environment and other things like that. And one of them, according to the New York Times, before he was ever known to anybody, was a young judge named John Roberts, who was one of the people who wanted to use the court this way. Well, now he's got a chance to do it. This is the kind of thing that's going to happen over and over and over again. On the Trump stuff, as you may have heard, there's some cases involving former President Trump at the Supreme Court. The two big ones, of course, one is they just last week heard arguments about the move by the Colorado Supreme Court to disqualify Trump from the ballot under the previously quite obscure provision of the Constitution that says if you engaged in an insurrection and had taken an oath that you could not serve in office. And the other, which is coming up now, is Trump's claim that he is immune from prosecution for the January 6th case because he had been president. That is, I think, a really big one. And one of the questions is, will they even take the case, or will they just agree with what the lower court did?
Yeah, no, I mean, it really is, that is a wild, wild idea, right? It's a wild, wild doctrine that you could literally like elect yourself. The people could elect you and have the same status as like Louis the 14th, and yet in American democracy, I mean, I just can't even imagine where that would go.
His lawyer in the Court of Appeals,
his lawyer was my classmate at Oxford on the Rhodes Scholarship. That guy was a tightly wound enigma then, and now we know
he has a tough client who was sitting there. But one of the judges actually said, "So wait a minute, because it's been assumed for most of the past century that current presidents can't be prosecuted, but former presidents, of course, could be." And remember, Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon because he was about to be indicted and prosecuted, and Ford thought that was bad, so he pardoned him. The Judge Lamb, I believe, asked your former classmate, wait a minute, so you're saying that Donald Trump or any president could order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate political opponents, and they couldn't be prosecuted for that after the fact? And what the attorney said was, unless Congress had impeached and convicted the president, presumably senators who were hiding under their desk because they were afraid they were going to get murdered, unless that had happened, then no, you could not prosecute a president for ordering assassinations of their opponents. So it was kind of an outlandish position that the court unanimously rejected, the lower court.
Yeah, no, but it just shows you just like how nuts not just some of my former classmates are, but how far some people are willing to go in subverting American democracy. And as a guy who doesn't just descend from two Black Reconstruction statesmen, but 7 members of the Massachusetts Regiment of the Continental Army. The fact that people want to create kings out of presidents is terrifying, like on the deepest level as an American. You referenced FDR and really the Roosevelt family's great tradition of kind of progressive campaigning. Like, let us not forget Teddy, let us not forget Mrs. Roosevelt. Like, all 3 of them just really defined what America became in the first half of the 20th century. What needs to happen now? What are the proposals that make sense now? What are the ones both that you think are ideal, but that also we might be able to get done? Because on this area, in a nation so divided, people have a lot of good ideas, and you look at them and you're like, well, under different circumstances, maybe that was possible, and maybe it's wise, but under present circumstances, like, what can we actually do? Because that's just a pipe dream. So talk to me about what you think is the best pipe dream, but also what you think we should be focused on now that we could actually accomplish.
Yes, and I think part of the answer to what should we do now, to me, I learn a lot from the history, which I learned in writing the book, which is, the part of the Constitution that deals with the courts and the Supreme Court is only 1/10 the length of the parts dealing with Congress and the president, the more democratically accountable branches. Only over time did the court attain the role it has now as a sort of a super legislature over the other branches, and only really because we give it that power. And part of the way the Supreme Court, as I think is the case, maintains that power is because it's largely reflected the political consensus of the time, whatever that consensus is. But there have been a few times in the country's history, as I would say we're in now, where the court has really overstepped, where it's been extreme or partisan or unduly activist. It happened in the run-up to the Civil War with the Dred Scott decision, which was so controversial and so reviled, it led to the rise of the Republican Party and the election of Abraham Lincoln as president. And it was a political backlash. The point is, it was not just lawyers with footnotes, but it was the stuff people talked about, fought about, cared about, voted about in politics. It also happened in the early 20th century, and you're right in mentioning Teddy Roosevelt. That was a time when, just like now, in some ways, the courts, the Supreme Court, the elitos of that court thought their job was to use the court to stop government from protecting people at this kind of birth of the industrial society, where there was so much inequality, so much economic dislocation, and they used the courts then to try to stop worker safety and other wage and hours laws and all kinds of other things. And that was also very political in the response. And Teddy Roosevelt, the Republican president, of course, this was one of the main issues on which he ran for president in 1912, when he ran as the progressive Bull Moose candidate, taking on the Supreme Court and actually putting forward some ideas that were seen even then as kind of too much. Like, he proposed that there ought to be a referendum where voters could overturn what the Supreme Court did on constitutional measures. That was a backlash. I would say there was a backlash too against some of the liberal rulings of the court, most of which I love, in the 70s and 80s, that helped create the political moment we're in right now. I think that we're in a moment like that where there's a chance for change and where people are voting on this. You've seen it in the recent elections. The public support for the Supreme Court has collapsed to the lowest level ever recorded in polls. Part of the answer is people should vote, but not and debate these issues. But there are also, as you say, reforms, specific reforms that I think are plausible that could make a difference with the Supreme Court. I'll mention 2 of them. One of them, the easiest one in a way, is ethics reform. We've learned in the last couple of years about some pretty outlandish conduct by some of the justices, taking very lavish vacations and other things and not disclosing it. This one guy, Harlan Crow, basically was subsidizing Justice Clarence Thomas's lifestyle for decades. Thomas used to disclose it. Then the Los Angeles Times wrote a story about it in 2002, so he then just stopped disclosing it. So that was one method of dealing with that. But Thomas, give you one example, Harlan Crow bought Clarence Thomas's mother's house and renovated it with her living in it. and paid for the education of Thomas's surrogate son. You know, if we were looking at Albany, New York, or Springfield, Illinois, or something like that, we would say, oh, that's the oldest story in the book. There's it's corruption. So ethics reform, where there's some real code of conduct with real enforcement and somebody so that it's not the justices policing themselves. They put out a kind of mealy-mouthed thing a few months ago. They said it was to just clear up the, quote, misunderstanding that the public had that there was some problem. So that's one. The harder one, but again, I think really valuable, would be to impose an 18-year term limit on justices. The basic idea is nobody should have too much public power for too long. In a sense, George Washington taught us that when he stepped down from the presidency after 2 terms. And, it's actually a really popular idea across the spectrum, more than you might realize. First of all, every state Supreme Court but one has term limits or a retirement age. So do the constitutional courts of every other major democracy. We're unusual in the way we have it alone, actually. And when I say it's popular, I learned this as a commissioner. I was appointed, as you mentioned, by President Biden to a commission on the Supreme Court a couple of years ago. And, these federal commissions, they're often a way to deflect action. And we were actually instructed at the outset not to reach conclusions. And we didn't, a government agency that works as intended. But what was really striking is we heard from dozens of public witnesses from left and right, not just dyed-in-the-wool progressives, all across the spectrum. And they disagreed on so many things. Some said, oh, we should expand the court. Others said we shouldn't. We should have ethics rules. We shouldn't. They all said, or so many of them at least said, oh, but by the way, I'm for term limits, of course. This is something that there's actually a national consensus on it, I think, hiding in plain sight. It could certainly be done by constitutional amendment. We at the Brennan Center believe, too, that it could be done by statute, that Congress could pass a law. The way it would work is the justices would move to senior status after 18 years. They would still have some role. They wouldn't lose their job, but they wouldn't be able to do the main things that they do now. And if coupled with presidents making an appointment every 2 years, it would drain a lot of the partisan toxicity out of the nominations process too, I hope and think. As I say, it's a really popular idea. Now, is anybody under any illusion that no matter how popular it may be right now with Democrats, independents, and Republicans, but it actually started to move? It wouldn't be like a big group hug, get all political. But I think it's going to happen one way or another, sooner or later. I think it's going to happen. There's just actually a durable consensus for it in the country.
No, I really do think that there is. But let's talk about corruption. Let's dig into that a bit more. Let me check the Q&A. I encourage folks, again, if you got questions, drop them in the Q&A tab, and we will get to them. If you watch Fox News, there's a lot of focus on urban corruption. They talk about corrupt cities all the time. Down here in Baltimore, especially their local affiliates, it's like a template that they use. Mm-hmm. And that dovetails with Sinclair Broadcasting, who owns a lot of those local affiliates, and they do the same thing.
And your local newspaper now too.
Yes, exactly. Right. Isn't that just creepy? I literally, yes. I mean, we should talk offline. I think there's an FCC angle with them. It really is wild. If you haven't paid attention to the Baltimore Sun, they've been bought by a right-wing wingnut connected to Sinclair Broadcasting and really to Fox, who intends to use it as their movement mouthpiece. But on the progressive side, despite the great tradition of crusading against corruption, you have like Bernie Sanders, and he's treated as a bit of an outlier. And if we want to get a little bit uncomfortable about it, you have Hillary Clinton, who would never tell anybody what she said to Goldman Sachs. And the net result is, if you look at polling that concerns me, is that the American people consider the Democrats now to be more captive by corporate America than the Republicans. And yet, you and I both know, when you look at the Supreme Court, there is literally an industry funded by industry to get us right-wing Supreme Court. justices. So what should the conversation about corruption be as it relates to the Supreme Court? What are the most egregious things? I mean, what you just laid out for Judge Thomas, if he was mayor of Baltimore, for example, he'd be in prison right now. So what should the conversation be that might lead us towards getting those ethics reforms, but also maybe reinvigorate activism around the court from the center, from the left?
So there really is a direct connection here in the sense, as you say, that the conduct is egregious. It's not just, oh, I took a steak dinner here and didn't disclose it. It's really systematic lifestyle support for these justices. A clue to the political significance of it actually came in the very first article that ProPublica, the wonderful website that broke so much of this news, and which I certainly hope wins a Pulitzer, if they're listening to me. Something they had in that first story. It was a painting. It was a painting that Harlan Crow had at his resort, one of the luxury resorts where he put up Clarence Thomas every year. And it's this absolutely kind of bizarre photorealist painting of a few people sitting around at the resort. And honestly, it looks like the painting of the dogs playing poker. It's kind of like that. But it's of Justice Thomas and Harlan Crow smoking cigars and Leonard Leo. Leonard Leo is the leader of the Federalist Society. He introduced Harlan Crow to Clarence Thomas after Thomas joined the court. He also introduced Alito to his billionaire benefactor, Paul Singer, who also took him on trips and didn't disclose it. And that was a kind of a second scandal story, not quite as lurid, honestly, as the Thomas stuff. And it was quite clear that part of what Leo thought his job was to make these connections between these new justices and the economic forces who really cared a lot about what the outcome of these cases at the Supreme Court was. Some of this we know because some members of Congress, especially Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who's a Democrat from Rhode Island, he's really been muckraking on this and blowing the whistle. But I do think you're right that ultimately it's up to the Democrats and the Republicans. But right now the Democrats say, oh, we're the party of democracy. And you hear, we've worked on these issues of democracy for so many years. It is a striking thing right now that poll after poll shows that the health of American democracy really is a top issue for millions of people. Democrats, but also independents, also many Republicans. It was determinative in a lot of elections. It's going to be obviously a very big issue in this election. But it can't just be, the democracy is on the ballot, democracy is at stake. That means vote for one party or another. There needs to be a full-throated, fully engaged commitment by, in this case, the Democrats. I would love it if it was both parties, but to get to bipartisanship, you got to start with one. To reforms, meaningful, deep, significant structural reforms to fix our system so these kinds of problems don't happen again. Now, the good news is there's some evidence of that. If you remember in the last Congress, HR 1 and S1, Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 1, was the Freedom to Vote Act, which combined with the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act went to the floor of Congress. This was the most significant democracy reform in a half a century. I think I think it was the most significant civil rights bill in many decades. And we came achingly close to passing it, more than people realize. I think it passed the House. President Biden was eager to sign it. It had a majority of the Senate for it. But as you know, two senators, Manchin and Sinema, were not willing to change the rules, the filibuster rule, so it could pass. I think next time around, the Democrats need to be united to do whatever it takes to bring these democracy reforms to reality. And that bill, it doesn't have everything under the sun, but it has national standards for voting. It restored the Voting Rights Act, which has been gutted, as we said, by the Supreme Court. It banned partisan gerrymandering. And it has significant campaign finance reform, too. Certainly an end to dark money in elections, but also at various stages, small donor public financing. So it was actually a really good bill. And that's the kind of thing, and there need to be court reforms and other things too. We need them to not just give speeches about democracy, but when they have power, use it for democracy. And that's up to all of us to make sure that the politicians do that. Elections are times when voters send signals to politicians, and often sometimes anyway, the politicians, to their surprise, hear the signals.
To what extent would you say this supermajority is a wholly owned subsidiary of industry, and if so, which or which industries?
Well, so far, a lot of the cases that have come before it that are particularly meaningful to business to business interests, over and over again, seem to benefit the interests of the fossil fuel industry. Ben, you remember, of course, the Citizens United case. That was in 2010. And that was the case that said it said that corporations could spend in elections the same as natural individuals, but that didn't turn out to be the kind of ultimately most significant part of it. It was actually led to the almost complete deregulation of money in politics, and in particular, the rise of super PACs, which is the vehicle through which there's unlimited contributions in these federal elections. And sometimes you get very cynical people. They say this about the voting bills too. They say, oh, this stuff, well, it all doesn't really matter. Everyone got all upset, but it doesn't matter. Look, Democrats raise money, Republicans raise money. So this stuff, in the end, it's a big wash. And I think that's nonsense. But the example I use is before Citizens United, before the deregulation of money that it set off, Republicans had a climate change bill. And then after, they didn't. And their fear of fossil fuel money in their primaries is the reason why. And that's, to me, a great example.
Oh, it is. It is. What gives you hope? You are a historian, not just a constitutional scholar. You're a speechwriter, not just a book writer. What gives you hope?
You assume I have hope, but yes, I do have hope.
I know you, Michael. I know you have hope.
What gives me hope is the fact that we're talking about this. That, as I said, that the issue of American democracy over and over again in polls and in voting is central to people. Every political consultant whispers in the ear of politicians, and you know this. They whisper, "Oh, nobody cares about this stuff. It's arcane. It's boring." Conservatives knew better when they ran on the Constitution and courts all those years. Finally, I think liberals and progressives are seeing it otherwise. One pollster I know, Democratic pollsters, talked about the 2022 election, where, if you remember, all these election deniers were running to become Secretary of State or sometimes governor, but these offices to control the levers of elections in these states after, embracing Trump's false claim of a stolen election. And they all lost in the key states. And actually, they ran behind other Republicans. I always point out that in Arizona, for example, the Secretary of State, there were many people who voted for Carrie Lake for governor who thought the Secretary of State candidate was too crazy to be in charge of elections. People got the significance of this stuff. So the hope is the political, to me, weirdly, maybe, is the political moment. And one pollster I know pointed out that there were many races that were decided on this issue in 2022, but strikingly, very few candidates actually ran on the issue. There weren't ads, there weren't giving speeches. When President Biden, in his summing up of the midterm election, said, democracy is at risk, American democracy is the key issue, everyone sort of rolled their eyes and said, that's nice, but it's really inflation or crime or immigration or something else. And it turns out for a lot of voters, they get the importance of the first principles of our country, which we haven't ever really lived up to, but driving toward that is the great goal. So that's what gives me hope, is the fact that people care. Now, part of the reason they care is because of the extraordinary threat. Trump, this is not a partisan statement, this is a factual statement, has made clear that should he have a second term, he intends to try to govern as an authoritarian. on a whole host of different issues, ranging from using the Justice Department to punish enemies to massive roundups of immigrants and more. And so getting ready to fight authoritarianism wherever it is also part of what we have to do.
No, that's so true. You know, we cannot afford to find ourselves as we did in 2016, surprised. This is definitely.
I will confess to having been somebody who did not think far enough ahead because I couldn't imagine what happened.
Yeah, yeah, no, and you know yeah, you know, and it's at Sierra Club. I was just told our team, you know, we have to uh, prepare for the worst, even as we hope for the best, we work for the best. We've got to prepare for the worst, and you know, confidential conversations with people in various federal agencies suggest that the federal agencies are already there, that they're preparing, and that is a worrisome sign. You know,
Well,
it is
give you an example that folks on this call might be interested in because it really deals with public policy as a profession. One of the things Trump says he wants to do at the very end of his term in 2020, he did something called Schedule F, which was to try to reclassify something like 50,000 civil servants as political appointees so they could be fired and then his supporters would be put in. And it didn't really happen. It was too late in the day, and Biden obviously rescinded it. But they've made clear, and it's not just Trump, it's a significant infrastructure now of think tanks and others. They've made clear they want to do Schedule F, and that would be a significant shift in how the federal government works and a significant repudiation of expertise. There are things that can be done now to try to slow that down, that some of which are happening. They're actually trying to change the rules to protect many more jobs as non-political in the federal workforce, as one example. So there are things people need to do, both because they're the right thing, but because the worst could come.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is real. And I guess, on if you had to place odds on this elections case and Trump and Colorado and will he be allowed to be on the ballot, what do you think happens? And if you don't mind walking through, it would be good for listeners to see how you view the different justices as thinking, right? There was a time when we saw Roberts as somebody who was less extreme. In actuality, maybe he's more of a corporatist and less of a, evangelical. But now there's 6, so he could even find himself in a minority. I mean, can you just kind of go through the supermajority and how you think each is likely to come out on this question of whether Trump should be kept from the ballot because he participated in insurrection, or that ruling by a couple of states should be overturned by the Supreme Court?
Sure. And you're right that, they, as I said, I think they largely move in lockstep. Roberts, I think, genuinely is more of an institutionalist in that sometimes he votes in a way that you think he really doesn't. This isn't his policy preference, but to try to steer the court away from controversy. He voted for upholding the Affordable Care Act, as you might remember, for example. He was, he wrote the majority in both the Voting Rights Act decision last June, which again was a real shocker because he had devoted his whole career to trying to destroy the Voting Rights Act, and in particular that sentence in the Voting Rights Act that was what was being discussed. So sometimes he has he, as I say, has his foot on the brakes. There's certainly, we all know that Thomas and Gorsuch and Alito in particular are predictably partisan in the way they rule. And that all of them have embraced originalism, this idea that the only legitimate way to interpret the Constitution is to ask what it meant to those who ratified it, which in most instances means property owning white men from the 1700s, which is kind of an absurd way to run a modern growing country. It's never been how the Supreme Court has ruled before, but it's quite literally what they're pushing. On this case, and I may have a different view from you on this, or a surprising view maybe from the audience listening. So I think this court is going to rule maybe unanimously or 8-1 to overturn what the Colorado Supreme Court did. The provision of the Constitution is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which was certainly obscure until we had an insurrection and a president who engaged in an insurrection. And it says that an officer of the United States who swore an oath and engaged in an insurrection cannot serve. And it doesn't say president, actually. When you read it, it kind of weirdly leaves out the president. But, one question is, could they really have meant everybody but the president? It does kind of read that way, but that's presumably not the only basis for it. From my perspective, Trump emphatically engaged in an insurrection. He's guilty as hell. And that is at least in part what he's going to go on trial for in Washington, D.C. and in Georgia as well. The question is who decides that. And in this case, it was one court in Colorado that said he couldn't serve. A Secretary of State in Maine did the same thing. Most other places came to a different conclusion. The Secretary of State of Missouri said, well, if that's going to be the case, then I'm going to keep Biden off the ballot and Kamala Harris, because they supported Black Lives Matter. And that, I think that's an insurrection. And so one of the challenges is if you have a patchwork of 50 states or counties or whatever doing this, it could get really messy really fast. So I know many people who were very disappointed to hear the argument where it was pretty clear that there's a strong majority, again, including probably the liberals on the court, not to uphold what Colorado did. And, that may be wrong. I would say of all the questioners, probably Justice Sotomayor was the most likely to want to uphold what Colorado's Supreme Court did. But it is also a question I would suggest for those of us who want to fight for democracy, if we think going in that this Supreme Court is highly, 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 highly unlikely to throw Donald Trump off the ballot, then it's a decision of why bring a case to them where Gorsuch and Alito and Thomas are going to get to weigh in and say, oh, he's innocent as the driven snow, On the other hand, I think this court will rule probably also unanimously that he is not immune from prosecution. The question is, when will they do that? They could give him a great gift by ruling slowly. I think Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, is hoping they will rule not at all. They'll just say, yeah, the lower court got it right, get on with the trial, or at least work very quickly, which they have the ability to do. Bush v. Gore was done, for better or worse, in 3 days. The Nixon tapes case was a few weeks from it being filed to argued to decided, and then Nixon leaving office. So they could act fast on this immunity thing. But so I just think it's unlikely that they're going to uphold what Colorado did. But what do you think? I mean, many people have different views on this, of course.
I think that you're probably right, and I think that these cases, me, sort of more of an electoral politics guy, I think that honestly, these cases only help build support for Donald Trump. They only inflame his base. Democrats, when they talk about unlikely voters, are usually referring to lower information Black and brown voters who are also typically tend to be lower income. Lower information, lower income tend to go together. While forgetting that, for example, while there are 8 million Blacks in poverty, there are 16 million whites in poverty. And there is the mirror image on the right. And those voters are more historically like cicadas. They come out like once a generation. They don't come out every election, principally because, in my estimation, the Republican candidates think Mitt Romney look like the villains in their lives. Mitt Romney looks like the guy who shut down your factory because he was the guy who shut down your factory, right? So if you're growing up in a family that used to be a union factory family that now is lucky if somebody gets a part-time job at Walmart, you have no interest in turning out for that guy. You don't turn out. But if you look at those voters and their behavior, right, they turned out for Ronald Reagan. They turned out for Jesse the Body Ventura. They turned out for Arnold Schwarzenegger. They turned out for B-rate movie and television stars. And then you have Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, like, appeals to them because, like Jesse the Body Ventura, for instance, he comes across as a bit of an iconoclast, as somebody who's there on the side of the working man. It's all a charade. He really aspires to be an oligarch. But I do think that all this plays to his deep base, and his deep base doesn't show up in most polls. And that's why, we saw the polls predict that Hillary would beat Trump by Michigan by 2. And no, by seven, and he beat her by 2. And so that 9-point swing scares me.
You see that kind of undercounting, not just in the United States, but in a lot of other countries where there's a similar sort of ethno-nationalist, populist backlash against economic change, deindustrialization, migration, and changing demographics. It plays out differently in different countries, but it's often the case that the polls undercount kind of the right-wing nationalist vote, whether it's in Turkey or Netanyahu in Israel or in Europe or here. Most of these issues are not new. Democrats as a party have managed to do well when they weave together their very disparate coalition around issues like economic issues that give people who are less educated the feeling that, well, at least they'll fight for me.
Yeah.
And there's now a structural problem the Democrats face as the electorate polarizes more and more around education. It's less and less the case that you appeal to these highly educated voters by talking in lunch bucket terms about, we'll fight for you, against the big shots who are running the economy. But that actually is, again, hugely popular, but it's also why you see increasing support for Trump among Latino and Black working class voters. Again, it's the sense that, well, he's strong. I don't really get all the details, but he's strong and he's in there fighting. And if the Democrats don't seem to have a populist bone in their body, they won't do very well. This is, again, though, where the money in politics, part of the democracy issue.
No, and if you
is so important.
Well, and to that point, go back to the fossil fuel industry. I know a couple of fossil fuel industry communications consultants because we work together on criminal justice reform and kind of left-right coalitions. Now I'm at Sierra Club, and I say to them, how does the oil industry view this moment in politics? And it says, oh, we're clear we are in a populist moment. That's why all of our messaging is simple. It's in plain language, and it's all about fighting inflation and keeping costs low. In that respect,
jobs
the Democrats
or whatever. Yeah,
Democrats would be wise to really understand. Well, if Donald Trump became the force he was in 2016, apart from learning every lesson that could be learned from Bernie Sanders, and if Dick Armey sent Bayard Rustin's old collected book of essays down the line to its highest price ever on eBay and every other kind of used book form by making it mandatory reading for the Tea Party.
Is that true?
That is 100% true.
Wow.
That is 100% true. Then maybe we need to recognize that the Republican Party is beating Democrats by using Democrats' old playbooks, all the way from the architect of the March on Washington, outgay Quaker architect, the March on Washington, Bayard Rustin, all the way through Bernie Sanders, and get back to our roots of convincing working people that we fight for them.
And remember, Rustin, and for those of you who have not seen it, I thought the recent movie Rustin, which I guess maybe is only on Netflix streaming, I don't think it made it into theaters. I thought it was really wonderful and really showed him and his role. And he was an extraordinary figure who organized the March on Washington, but because he was an out gay man, was sidelined, pushed out by some of the more establishment figures in the civil rights movement. And Dr. King actually brought him back in. But he also was a labor activist.
Yeah, ironically, out of Clayton Powell, because Strom Thurmond attacks Bayard Rustin and King on the floor of the Senate using Bayard Rustin's sex life at a time when it was understood that gentlemen didn't do that to each other. And Adam Clayton Powell, who had made a similar threat to King years earlier to delay the march, seizing the moment, excoriates Strom Thurmond from the well of the House. And that gets the young people in the movement to push Bayard back into the fore. He'd been kept in the background, the shadows, because of embarrassments over some citations he had gotten, police targeting of gay men. And in many ways, many will say folks were involved in Stonewall, that was the spark of the modern gay rights movement. These young people realizing that they could push an out gay leader out there and in the sense of their own power to transform the left.
That's why, again, the true history of the country, as we know, there's a major effort now to kind of sandblast out of our history anything that might make anybody uncomfortable. In my way, some white people uncomfortable. The true story of the country is an inspiring story, at least in part, of people inspiring each other. And I hadn't realized that connection. The other thing I was going to say is, if you see the movie, his mentor is A. Philip Randolph, who was, of course, one of the great labor leaders. So there was a time when the liberal movement understood the interconnectedness of the economic issues and the legal issues, the justice issues. And they spoke in a language that wasn't alienating to millions of people, that was everyday language, but it was challenging language. I encourage everybody to see that movie, among many others.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is a great one. And Jeffrey Wright right now, I think, is on a tear of making some really great.
He played Adam Clayton Powell there.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and the interesting thing, of course, you want to get back to those old Harlem days, is Adam Clayton Powell's congressional seat was created for A. Philip Randolph. And at the coronation, where A. Philip Randolph was going to be announced as the candidate for Congress, first or second Black member in the House, Adam Clayton Powell volunteered to give the invocation, to say the prayer. And Adam Clayton Powell's style, he said the prayer and then announced he was running for Congress. And with the graciousness of the senior statesman civil rights movement, Adam Clayton Powell was, and he said, look, if the young guy wants it, he can have it. Didn't even put up a fight.
He was the pastor at Abyssinian Baptist, which,
yes,
of course.
Yeah, exactly.
And Senator Warnock had been a pastor earlier in his career at the same church.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this was a real joy. It's always fun to be with you, friend. I think folks must have just been captivated by the conversation. We didn't get any audience questions, but man, what a great conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. I'm going to bring back on our dean, Sally Bachman, to close us out.
Thank you.
That was amazing, simply amazing. Thank you so much, Ben and Michael, for this just fantastic hour and the unbelievable discussion. And all that you were talking about is so important to us here at SP2 as we act on our dedication to really understand the root causes of oppression and inequities. Of course, we are steadfast in our commitment to push back on these forces through our focus on inclusion and social justice in really all we do with you, with colleagues, students, alumni, and external partners. I also want to say thank you to everyone who joined us today. Our next installment of the Speaker Series is going to be another exciting one, an in-person event on March 13th. Ben, I hope you can get here by then.
I will be there.
With your leg, in conversation on racial healing with former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. Really amazing. You can find information on how to register in the chat, and we will also be sending additional information about this event in email. Thank you all, and take care. And thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ben. It was truly extraordinary, an extraordinary time. Thank you.
No, thank you, Sally. And I got to tell you, that conversation we have coming up in public with the former Republican governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell, is a great source of hope for me. He's an evangelical Christian. He's a graduate of Pat Robertson's law school. He's also a deeply fair man who showed a lot of courage at restoring voting rights for formerly incarcerated people in Virginia. Frankly, when Tim Kaine refused to do the same thing as the prior governor. And so we got to keep looking for these kind of places of hope in a deeply divided country. I think folks will enjoy the conversation as they come through.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Amazing.